Thank you, Donald. And a day of mourning in America. It is, of course, the state funeral that's taking place right now of George Bush Sr. We'll talk a bit about that later on in the hour. But we're going to focus tonight on Westminster, or should I say the Westminster soap opera. Another day. Now, you remember last night, the government lost this vote. They were found in contempt of Parliament. The first time this had ever happened in UK parliamentary history. And so, sure enough, at 11:30 this morning, they published the document. Did it tell us anything we didn't know? Well, in terms of direction of travel, there were no surprises, but the precise nature of this full legal advice was much, much bleaker than anything we'd heard before, and certainly any impression that Mrs. May had given us. It confirmed that if at the end of the transition period we have not been able to agree a new trade deal with the European Union, they would be able to trigger the backstop, which would keep us locked in, effectively would annex Northern Ireland, and it would, I quote from a document, endure indefinitely. And I think for Northern Ireland this was extraordinarily bad news. Here it was, writ large. Now, the first response we got to it, and because we moved on very quickly to Prime Minister's questions before really people had had a chance to absorb the document, the funny thing was, PMQs went on with questions about local constituency hospitals and jobs and the normal business of PMQs, and it was all happening as if the dramas of Brexit weren't really happening. It was a rather sort of phony, not that those issues aren't important, but sort of phony war period, until the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford, got up to speak.
What we have is a government in crisis. A government that has lost 2 Brexit secretaries, a Home Secretary, a Foreign Secretary, a Work and Pension Secretary. A government that has suffered from 3 consecutive defeats in just 2 hours. The first government to do so, Mr. Speaker, in 40 years. And now a government found to be in contempt of Parliament. Is it time that the Prime Minister took responsibility? A responsibility for concealing the facts on her Brexit deal from members in this House and the public. Will she take responsibility?
Prime Minister. He's absolutely wrong about that. We have not concealed the facts on the Brexit deal from members of this House. What he will see is that the legal position that was set out on Monday in the 34-page document, together with the statement made and the answers to questions given by the Attorney General on Monday, very clearly set out the legal position.
Well, the Prime Minister didn't conceal it, but she didn't exactly elaborate on it. And I think this document, as I say, if from a Northern Irish perspective, this legal advice was pretty awful. If you're a unionist, and before you knew it, the Deputy Leader, Nigel Dodds, was up, and he was questioning this afternoon the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid.
Northern Ireland will treat Great Britain as a third country. How can he possibly stand here and recommend this deal and say that it brings to an end the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice and takes back control?
And the DUP are a really important part of this story, and indeed the conversation I'm going to have with you tonight, because the Brexit spokesman, Sammy Wilson, went on later on this afternoon to say that this deal doesn't deliver on the referendum result, and he attacked the government for concentrating on a mythical problem that does not exist. And what, of course, he's talking about is this hard border on the island of Ireland. I have to say, I'm with Sammy Wilson on this, because I asked Mr. Barnier, would the EU put up a hard border? No. The British government, when they're asked, will they put up a hard border, said no. And indeed the Taoiseach said, even in the event of a no-deal WTO Brexit, they won't put up a hard border either. And yet, we are where we are. And I spent a bit of today chatting with some quite, senior, veteran political commentators and journalists, and we all agreed between ourselves at lunchtime that none of us have got a clue, really, what's going on. Now, I do have a prediction for where we're going to go, but I'm going to hold it back until the end of this hour's debate. But I want to know from you. Come on, tell me. What do you think is going to happen next? By how many votes is Mrs. May going to win or lose next Tuesday? And where does this all end? And if you think the government is going to fall by Christmas, call 0345 6060 973. Maybe you think, against all the odds, actually, the Brexiteers will be so scared, and even the DUP so worried about the prospect of a Corbyn government that by the skin of her teeth, and maybe after a concession or two that she gets from Brussels, she'll get it through, in which case text to 84850. Or do you think there's now a prospect that maybe a second referendum is coming? If that's the way you feel, please tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course, watch us on Facebook and comment there too. I'm going to hold back my prediction. I want to hear what you've got to say. So what is it, folks? Do the DUP bring down the government? Does that mean that Mrs May gets toppled and there's a leadership election? Does it mean there could be a general election? Is it possible, despite the amendment that Dominic Grieve got through the last night, that actually the government decides to tough it out and we leave on WTO rules on March the 29th? Or are they going to suspend the date of Article 50, push it forward for a year or two, and maybe make us vote again? Let me know what you think about all this, because I tell you, the experts haven't got a clue. Going to go to Phil in Chessington, a new caller. Good evening, Phil.
Hi, Nigel. How are you?
Hello, Phil.
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Good evening. So, what do you make of all of this?
Well, I've been watching Parliament all day, really, throughout work, and I think what stands out as being so obvious is that the makeup of Parliament does not reflect the voter base. Even in constituencies where there's clear support for leave, the MP tends to be a Remainer. So we have a Parliament that doesn't reflect the people, a Parliament that is determined to go against the will of the people, to go against the vote. I think it's self-evident that Theresa May's plan is going to be rejected by Parliament.
Next Tuesday, yeah?
She can get it through. It's going to be probably 100 vote.
100 vote, right?
I would imagine. But
my first prediction, Phil, is 100 votes, yeah. And what then? What then?
To me, we're going to be forced into a second referendum. I think that's practically unavoidable. I think it's now. I think the problem is that when this is being proposed, the issue that was always brought up is that when we voted to leave, I was an ardent Brexiteer. When we voted to leave, that we didn't know what we were voting for, and so this concept of it being put back on the table, that we would have a vote on maybe to either remain or to leave under WTO rules or to leave under Theresa May's deal, would be on the table. But I know what I didn't vote for. I definitely didn't vote to remain. So then I don't understand why that would even be part of a referendum.
Well, but Phil, don't you sum up in a way what's really going on here? What's really happening is that despite the fact we were given this referendum, despite the fact we were promised in the referendum and in the general election, the result would be honoured, the truth, Phil, is the political class do not want to give us a clean Brexit, do they?
No, they don't. I mean, the only referendum that should possibly be put in front of the British people is a choice between the two ends of the spectrum. Leave under May's deal, which is basically leaving the European Union but as good as staying in, or the far opposite end, WTO, and people can choose which end of the options they were closer to when they voted for Brexit. And I think the other thing is... Well,
I tell you what, Phil, there's very little chance of that being the question.
I understand that, but I think the other thing that people are missing is, clearly Theresa May has no intention of wanting to leave the European Union herself. And that was obvious from square one, and I think that's been even more reflected recently, given the fact she is one of the few leaders of the Western world that is going to vote for the Migration Pact.
Now I tell you what, Phil, I'm going to talk a bit later on about the Migration Pact. Yeah. Thanks for your call, and Phil there reckons she loses by 100 votes and we get a second referendum. Gordon in Minehead said, I predict a general election, Nigel. Well, that's not impossible. Kevin in Wimbledon says he thinks Theresa May will lose the vote. I predict she will get circa 225 votes. Well, that would mean a crushing loss in that case. Next options are a second referendum or a Norway-style deal. Well, the Norway-style deal is being punted around by more and more people. I don't know whether it's really a goer. I don't know. And Christian from Bury St Edmunds says, is it possible that Brexit will be cancelled and Britain will remain in the European Union? The whole thing swept under the rug. Do I hear an undertone of that from yourself? No, I do not believe this could happen. The idea that Brexit just gets cancelled is impossible. It would completely destroy the Conservative Party as we know it. Tom in Ottershaw is a new caller to the show. Good evening, Tom.
Hi, Nigel. Good evening. Thanks for taking my call.
So, come on.
Nice to speak to you.
Predict.
Right.
Tell us what's going to happen.
Absolutely, the deal will get voted down. It's very, very obvious. It's a total dog show. But what I think is being set up here is for a Remain. And I agree with you that it won't happen. But that's what the EU's trying for. I don't think they're actually going to allow an extension. I think they'd use one country's veto, or the qualified majority veto, to prevent an extension. And they've already set it up for, oh, yes, you can remain, come back in.
Well, of course,
keep your rebate.
Yeah, of course, what they have said, Tom, of course, is, at least the Advocate General said this week, didn't he, that if we wanted just to cancel Article 50 completely and stay in, that would be fine. But you think they'd stop us extending, do you?
That's right. I think it's a plan. And this isn't Brexit in name only. This is actually Operation Sea Lion by another name. That's what it is.
Explain to people, Tom, what Operation Sea Lion was all those years ago.
That was Germany's plan to invade Britain.
And is that how you see this?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. The EU's run for the benefit of Germany, and to a lesser extent France. We've always been not the poor relation, been the rich relation. It's been paying.
Well, one thing for certain, Tom, is the Germans have done very well out of it over the last few years. Tom, I thank you. Carol says, I think the present government will collapse. Rav says, what happens next is your little Brexit fantasy is no more. Rav, dream on. This isn't going away, despite everything. Public opinion, if anything, amongst Leave voters is hardening. It is not softening. And Shazwellin says, I predict they will suspend Article 50, like they've done over the last 2 years. Well, what they have done, of course, again and again, is to extend the transition period, and suspension of Article 50, if this deal cannot get through, is far from impossible. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:15 and time. One thing for certain, yesterday was the day the Prime Minister completely lost control, losing 3 votes in the House of Commons, including a vote on that the government had actually been in contempt of Parliament, something that had never, ever happened before. Today, the full legal advice gets published. It paints an even starker picture of what the backstop actually means for Northern Ireland, and indeed, I think as a consequence, the whole of the United Kingdom, and that this could go on indefinitely. I wonder what's going to happen from here, folks, because all the experts haven't got a clue. I wonder, are the DUP so enraged by what they've seen today that they will actually bring this government down? And would that mean a new Prime Minister? Would it mean a general election perhaps taking place in the middle towards the end of January? Does it mean actually what happens is the government stands strong and says, we try to get our deal through, we failed, we will now leave on WTO terms, and damn you. Would that be possible, or would the Speaker intervene? I want your predictions. Now, David in Croydon says, I predict we leave on WTO. John feels very differently and says there's more chance of the stars falling from the sky than getting the Brexit people voted for. And John from Burnham-on-Sea is convinced that May will be removed within a week and replaced by David Davis, the only one up to the job. John, sounds great from your perspective, but, would David Davis be able to take over without it being contested? Would it be, as they used to call it years ago, the magic circle inside the Tory party would pick a leader without a contest? That doesn't look very likely to me. Mary says, I think she'll lose by at least 150 votes. I hope we don't have a second referendum. But Mary, here's the problem. And here's the dilemma for people who feel about this deal the way I do, and clearly you do. If this deal does get voted down once, maybe twice, in some ways, the risk of a second referendum gets greater. That's the big dilemma the Eurosceptics face. Carl in Belfast is a new caller. Carl, good evening to you.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. So the DUP are absolutely enraged by this legal advice.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because, they're very much, they've obviously got to look after their own sort of outlook on Brexit, but they have to remember that a large proportion of the Northern Ireland population voted to stay in the EU. But what I did want to touch on was that
just quickly, Carl, before you move on. I mean, I completely understand what you say, and I know Sammy Wilson. He's as Eurosceptic as I am, but isn't the DUP's real priority maintaining the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom?
Of course it is. But I feel that a lot of the decisions, I mean, they don't seem to be talking cross-party talks here. They seem to be just going in feet first. But the thing I actually wanted to say very quickly
please.
Is my father worked in imports and exports for 35 years, and he was actually in charge of imports and exports for the Indonesian government. And he was telling me that 30 years ago they were doing frictionless inspections and verifications between them and other Asian countries. So I don't understand what the whole issue is over having cameras on a hard border whenever this was being done 25, 30 years ago. I think it's been used in the wrong way.
Well, I mean, Carl, this whole idea of the hard border that we repeatedly hear from Monsieur Barnier, that for some reason last December Mrs May swallowed this concept and signed up to it. I mean, the whole thing is a complete myth. And as you say, with modern technology, if there are tariffs to be collected, everything would get logged and registered online. I completely and utterly agree with that. But we are where we are, Carl, and she signed up to this, and I'm with you, unnecessarily. What do you think will happen next?
Who knows? It's just
have a stab. This is like playing pin the tail on the donkey. I know, but what do you think?
I can't see her getting it through.
No,
I can't. But the problem we have now is that is it going to head for a second referendum? And I just think it's just really smacks in the face of people who voted it first time around. So it's I don't know. It's such a difficult call.
It's difficult. No, Carl, it's a difficult call for everybody. Thank you very much indeed for your perspective on frictionless trade taking place years ago in Indonesia. So why can't we do the same thing? Dale is calling from Luton, another new caller. Good evening, Dale.
Hi, yes, I'm a bit nervous, first time caller, but my view on it is that I think she will win the vote next week, believe it or not.
Do you?
Yeah. I say the reason why I think it is, I think the memo which was leaked by the legal advisor, or was it the solicitor, has been done deliberately so that she then goes back next week, whether it is to the EU, and then gets that thing with the backstop changed.
You see now.
I think that's been, I actually do think that's what's been done deliberately, because she knew in the first place it wouldn't get voted through. So it's this way, it's trying to please the others, and then they'll think, like, okay, we'll vote it through then. And I think she will win it next week.
The timing, Dale, is interesting, isn't it? So let's just remind people of the timing of this. The 11th, next Tuesday, is when the big vote happens. Let's say she loses by, 100 votes or 120 votes or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
We then have, on the 13th, the evening of the 13th, the next big European summit, and all of the 28 prime ministers and presidents will be there, and she would then go, Dale, and ask for concessions. And I do wonder, actually, given that they've won absolutely every single point of this game up until now, if they were to change the wording just a little bit on the backstop, she'd then put it back to the Commons, wouldn't she? Maybe even on Friday the 14th. And you think with a concession they'd vote it through?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I tell you what. You sound so convinced of that, Dale, that I hope you make a lot of money on the back of it. I really, really do. And I thank you for calling in. There was no need to be nervous. He knew his mind, did he not? I predict on Twitter, I get the deal will not pass. We will then get a referendum on a hard Brexit versus remaining in the EU. Well, John, that's very much what Tony Blair is pushing for. He's saying if there's a second referendum, it has to be a WTO Brexit or remaining in the European Union. And I think, I heard Vince Cable the other day talking about it's Mrs May's deal versus remain. That's just nonsense. I mean, many of us in that situation would simply have to abstain because we weren't being offered a proper Brexit. Now, I get that. There's no name on this, but for pity's sake, when are you people going to take responsibility for the chaos you've caused and stop demanding the impossible when it's not delivered, accusing everybody else of sabotaging the will of the people? You and the DUP and the ERG have set our nation back 2 generations. Well, actually, matey, we're trying to get into the 21st century because we don't really like these European treaties that were drawn up back in the 1950s. We don't like the idea of being governed by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. And we see a great big exciting world out there, and we want to compete and trade with them and get on with them. And honestly, what Brexiteers are criticising isn't Brexit, it's the way the Prime Minister has dealt with it. Brian is certain. He's the opposite to Dale. He says, I predict a second referendum, in or hard out. What does Joe in Enfield, a new caller, predict? Joe, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
Welcome.
I was very briefly. I was a real supporter of Theresa May over the last 2 years, saying that she had an incredibly difficult job. Little did I know, she's now taken all of her clothing down, and she's not pretending anymore. What she's done is really orchestrated this from the very beginning. That there has been no negotiation. I think Westminster are actors within the whole game, and I don't think they ever intended to give us Brexit. I agree that what's going to happen is it's going to be voted down. They'll come back, water it down, and we'll all think as though we've been represented. But Westminster is not representing us, and I cannot believe the media are not actually saying how, at worst, they're being dishonest.
Well, I mean, some commentators are, Robert. I mean, to me, and I do agree with this, even if she gets a concession, right, some change of wording, if she comes back for a vote on, say, Friday the 14th of December, unless you can convince the DUP, she's going to lose, isn't she?
Well, I actually think that it would be very unpalatable for Westminster to go for a second referendum. And I believe that generations to come will lose all faith in politics whatsoever. But that would be very dangerous for the country to have a second referendum. I can't see it.
But do our political class care about that?
No, because they do not want to give us Brexit, and whatever way they don't have to give us Brexit, they'll go with. And that is a guaranteed way of not giving us Brexit, going through a second referendum. I'd agree with that.
Well, I know. I tell you what, Joe, if there was a second referendum, I think the Leave side would win it by a bigger margin. But I wonder whether they'd accept even that. And it really is tough to tell. Joe, thank you very much indeed. On Twitter, I get, our Prime Minister does seem to have Teflon in her veins, but I hope she is gone by next week. The deal will be rejected, and I assume there'll be a second referendum. Well, Avrind, let's see. I haven't yet told you what I think, but I will a bit later on. But for now, you're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and it's 6:30 in time. I want your predictions. What's going to happen in the vote next Tuesday? And is the Prime Minister going to survive? Is there going to be a general election? Will the DUP bring her down? Could David Davis, it was suggested, be anointed as the next leader? Or is Article 50 going to get suspended? Is it going to get completely cancelled and we won't leave? Or is a second referendum on the cards? I want your predictions. I'll give you mine at the end of this hour. Meanwhile, across in Washington, D.C., the life of former US President George H.W. Bush has been celebrated at his funeral in Washington. From the United Kingdom, representing the Queen, Prince Charles is there, Sir John Major is there, obviously Theresa May, too busy to go. Many other world leaders there at the service for the 94-year-old who died last week, and all the former presidents there, including, of course, Donald Trump with his wife Melania, and very clear for all to see that Hillary Clinton found it very difficult to greet the current president. But perhaps the most powerful and the most moving part of the service was the speech given by one of the former president's sons, a former president himself, George W. Bush, who spoke about his final words.
Last Friday, when I was told he had minutes to live, I called him. The guy answered the phone, said I think he can hear you, but he hadn't said anything for most of the day. I said, Dad, I love you and you've been a wonderful father. And the last words he would ever say on earth were, I love you too. To us, he was close to perfect, but not totally perfect. His short game was lousy. He wasn't exactly Fred Astaire on the dance floor. The man couldn't stomach vegetables, especially broccoli. And by the way, he passed these genetic defects along to us. When the history books are written, they will say that George H.W. Bush was a great president of the United States. So through our tears, let us know the blessings of knowing and loving you, a great and noble man, the best father a son or daughter could have. And in our grief, let us smile knowing that Dad is hugging Robin and holding Mom's hand again.
And that reference at the end there obviously was to Barbara Bush, who died pretty recently, and Robin was a daughter that they lost to leukemia at the age of 3 years old. Pretty powerful words there, I thought, and pretty well done from George W. Bush. Another story that will come up next week and has got very little attention at the moment, and I guess that's because Brexit is dominating everything, but in Marrakesh next week, on Monday and Tuesday, there's going to be a meeting, big United Nations meeting, and they're putting on the table a global compact for migration. They're asking countries to sign up to these principles, and whilst it's legally non-binding, the UN believes that once countries have agreed to this, they are morally bound by it. What does it involve? Well, it quite deliberately would blur the lines between what is a refugee and an economic migrant. There is a clause there, which, and it may be amended, but they're encouraging governments only to provide material support and even possibly financial support for media organisations that support their worldview of migration, not for media outlets that support xenophobia and racism. And I really do worry that the UN now, it seems to me, are decrying, for example, a newspaper group who think we should control immigration and be very sensible about economic migrants coming into Britain, that they're about to be categorised as somehow being xenophobic or perhaps even guilty of hate speech. This stuff does matter. Hungary have said they're not going to go and sign it. The Americans have said they're not going to go and sign it. The Australians have said they're not going to go and sign it. The Israelis have said they're not going to go and sign it. The British government think it's a wonderful thing. If Brexit doesn't continue to completely dominate everything, I will try at some point over the course of the next week to have a proper debate about what this UN Global Compact actually stands for. But back to the soap opera that is Westminster, the difficulty everybody's having in predicting what is going to come next. And I'm asking you, tell me, what's going to happen? Robert on Facebook says, I predict May is finished. As soon as she loses the vote, the next infighting will be for the Tory leadership. But, Robert, when would they do that? Would it be over Christmas and the New Year? How many weeks would it take? Is it possible? Is it even conceivable that the Conservative Party could find a new leader without there being a contest? I just don't see it. And Richard in Seaford makes a point that I sort of hinted at earlier when he says, what's the point of a second referendum? If the establishment doesn't like the result, they will ignore it like the first one. Richard, that is a very real risk. Les is calling from Anglesey. Hi, Les.
Hi, Les. Hi, Nigel.
Hello. Hi there. So what's going to happen, Les? Come on.
I think the government are going to lose by a big margin, of sort of at least 80.
Yep.
I think it's designed to force a second referendum, and I think that Theresa May and the puppeteers in the background have been plotting together. It's nothing less than a thinly veiled plot to usurp the will of the people, in my mind.
So you think the Prime Minister has been complicit in a plot to make the people vote again? Is that what you're really saying?
I do.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, Les, let me ask you. Are you the sort of person that always distrusts our leaders?
No, not at all. And although she was a Remainer, I thought she would actually do a good job of negotiating Brexit. But with the latest release of the legal details now, it's clear that we'd never be able to leave the EU unless they deemed it acceptable to them. Why would they do that? They don't want us to leave.
Well, we could, Les, just say, cheerio, chaps, we're leaving, couldn't we?
That's what I want us to do. So just on the other point that people have been raising, in that people didn't know what they were voting for, well, when we originally joined the EU, it was a vote in or out. There was a later vote whether we stayed in or came out. So that was an in-out. So I think it was very clear what people were voting.
That's not quite true, Les. There was no referendum on us joining what was then called the Common Market EEC. No vote at all. Parliament just did it. There was then a vote a few years later in 1975 about whether we stayed in or whether we left. So it was slightly different, but yes, it was a binary choice. I agree with you. Well, Les, thank you for your call, and Les, who's lost all trust and faith and confidence in the government at all. I get here, whether we have a referendum or general election, I fear those recently becoming of age to vote have been totally ignored. Maybe if their vote is large enough, it could affect the result in ways not considered by Parliament and the media. Well, I promise you, these things are being considered, because at the moment, there are more young people who appear to support the European Union than don't support it. The opposite to what it is in the rest of Europe. And Ged in West Yorkshire says May will lose on Tuesday, and then I believe we're going to go back to a second referendum, and the options will be May's deal, WTO, or stay in Europe, which will split the Brexit votes in two, enabling Remainers to win the vote. Ged, I do not believe, I mean, even though things have happened that I find difficult to comprehend, I do not believe we're going to get a multiple choice type of referendum if there is ever a second referendum on this. And I think the Electoral Commission's guidance notes on referendums would suggest they wouldn't approve this either. Danny in Ealing is a new caller. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Nigel. Thanks for taking the call.
So how many votes, Danny, does she win or lose by next Tuesday?
I don't know, Nigel, but I think she's going to do a deal with Labour. Labour just after a general election. Yeah. So I think she'll just say to Labour, just put this through and we'll give you a general election next year sometime.
Oh, but Danny, why would... I mean, that would be like Labour signing a blank cheque, wouldn't it?
No, I think, to be honest with you, that is all they're after. That is what they want to force through.
All right, but I mean, Danny, you know, that doesn't work, does it? Because all she could do is make them a promise that she may never deliver on.
She'd have to. I mean, it's a promise, so if she goes back in the promise, you know, she's just highlighting that she's not a very responsible and, a decent Prime Minister, so to speak.
Okay, I'm just sort of thinking your logic of your argument through. So she could say, couldn't she, we're going to have a general election on the first Thursday of April after we've left the Treaty of Rome.
I should imagine it'd be a bit later than that, but possibly, yeah.
Okay, no, all right. Well, Danny, I tell you what, the idea of her doing a deal with Labour is not impossible. Our previous caller took us back to the 1970s and us joining what was then colloquially called the Common Market, and that was done with the support of Labour rebels. So doing deals across parties on this European issue is something we've seen before. Danny, I thank you very much indeed for your call. John here, driving in Austria. I think we should stay in the EU, but don't pay any more money, and then they will kick us out. Oh, come on, John, really? You know, surely the way we do things in this country is we obey the rules. And if we're in the club, we pay the membership fee. If we're not in the club, we don't pay the membership fee. Unless we want to leave the European Union, and then the Prime Minister volunteers 39 billion for starters. I know it's quite hard to believe, really, isn't it? You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 6:45, and come on, folks, what's going to happen? You tell me, is she going to lose this vote? Is she going to stay as Prime Minister? Is there going to be another general election? Is Article 50 going to be suspended? Is there going to be a second referendum? Are we not going to leave at all? And I'm asking you to tell me what you think, because I promise you, none of the experts really have a clue. Haven't yet told you what I think, but I will in a few minutes. I wonder who's going to persuade me. Keith on Facebook says, I don't care what happens as long as Corbyn never becomes PM. Well, I tell you what, Keith, he's getting a bit closer. And the DUP, I think, could play a very, very pivotal role in all of this. Johnny is calling from Liverpool, a new caller. Hi, Johnny.
Good evening, Nigel. Thank you for taking my call. Just wanted to talk around the prediction on what might happen. I do think she will lose the vote. I think she's going to lose it significantly, between 80 to 100 votes. But I just wanted to play back the context behind where we're heading, because I do think we are heading for, it's actually not a second referendum, it's a third referendum. We had the initial one back in the 70s.
Because of a 75 one, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it frustrates the life of people call it a second one. It will be a third referendum. And that's part of the point, really. Democracy is a fluid concept. And 2 years ago, it's reasonable to suggest that the electorate did not have all the information on both sides of our relationship.
Oh, please. We've been a member over 40 years, Johnny.
Let me make a point, Nigel. when any referendum or election comes along, it focuses people's minds. They re-engage with politics at a moment in time. They were presented arguments on both sides. Both sides have mistruths, both sides have facts. Over the last 2 years, the conversation and discussion around our relationship with the EU has evolved. It would be nonsensical to say we have to have the same information now that we had 2 years ago. That would be a mistruth.
So, Johnny, I'm sorry, you said democracy is a fluid concept, right?
Of course it is.
So you're suggesting we should have another vote on whether we should leave the EU even before we've left it? I mean, surely you carry out the first vote, and then down the road, you might want to have another vote on it. But the reason this second referendum's being talked about, Johnny, is because the big banks, the big businesses and big politics don't accept the result.
No, I don't agree at all, Nigel. I think one of the mistruths that's being told as well is that we're going to lose a generation to democracy by having a second referendum.
Well, we certainly are.
Well, no, we're not, Nigel, because as you've admitted yourself, overwhelmingly, the under-40s voted to remain. The generation that have voted to take us out of the EU are in the last throes of their own democracy. They are literally dying off. Our generation are open-minded, socialist in their views, and nationalism to us isn't a concept.
So what are you going to do, Johnny, when Italy leaves the European Union, the Eurozone collapses, the Hungarians go, the Poles go, and you're just left with Germany? What are you going to do? Join them?
It's not going to happen.
It's happening. It's happening before your eyes, Johnny.
It's not.
Young people, Johnny. Young people.
These are the last throws of people like your ideology,
Johnny,
having their last throws.
Johnny,
remember, it's darkest before.
Johnny, what is wrong with nation-state democracy? Why do you want to be? Why do you, as a representative of the youth of this country, as you put yourself up to be, why do you want to be governed by the unelected Junckers and Tusks and Barniers? What is so attractive about that?
Do you know one point that's not been made about that? Is because I'm from Liverpool. My city was decimated under the Tory government, and the only reason it currently exists and is on revival is because European money, our money, is poured through Europe and redistributed evenly across the UK. Not in the London South bubble. It is the European Union.
So you've been saved by the dictators of Brussels, have you?
Not dictators. Oh
well, I tell you what, they're behaving like it, Johnny.
Can I give you one last point? How ridiculous it is. If you're a cow and you're born in Belgium, you have no idea you're a Belgian cow. The concept of nationalism is a construct. It's a political construct.
Johnny, you're away with the fairies. The vast majority of people all over the world want to live in an identifiable nation state. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a perfectly normal state of affairs. And I think your idea... I mean, do you want world government, Johnny?
No, I don't want world government.
Why not?
Nationalism is important because it gives people a sense of belonging.
Right.
It shouldn't be there to put up barriers and borders. It shouldn't be.
So you don't believe in borders?
I don't believe in borders, no.
Okay, fine. All right, no, Johnny, I get it. That's fine. That's your honest opinion, and I get why you're pro-EU. I've got to the bottom of it, and I thank you for the call and for our chat. Right. Toby says, my prediction is Mrs May's deal will not get through Parliament, and she'll say to us that Brexit cannot be done. Toby, surely, even for me, it can't get that bad. She can't do that. I mean, even the ERG then would get 48 letters in. Steve is calling from Baker Street, a new caller. Hi, Steve.
Yeah, hi, Nigel. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Let me tell you what I think is going to happen. May will lose next week. She'll go back to the EU and get nowhere. But something interesting is going to happen in the middle. We know that the UK has been unable to negotiate with any other country concerning new trade agreements. We know last week in Buenos Aires, May admitted that she was already talking to some other countries. So what I think is going to happen is in the meantime, when Europe is thinking about saying no or maybe thinking about tweaking something, your friend Mr. Trump, your friend AB from Japan and the rest of the guys are going to come back to support the UK, and they're going to say to Mrs May, we are going to give the UK an amazing deal for a period of time. And that way, if and when that happens, which I think it will happen, the UK people who are sitting on the fence will turn around and go, actually, a no deal is actually not a bad thing because we've got 5 or 6 countries that we can immediately do better business with today and we'll work on what happens with Europe.
Well, Steve, there is the Five Eyes thing, isn't there? Or, you know, the big 5 countries that cooperate in terms of intelligence sharing and military, and they could perhaps have a greater trade deal. So, I have heard some of these ideas talked about before. Trouble is, Steve, that she's got between now and Christmas. There isn't time, is there, to get all this done?
There may not be enough time, but if the UK population that voted for Brexit believes that there actually are some deals ready to be done, and Trump comes in with some jumbo deal with a 2-year special tariff treaty, etc., the people who are sitting on the fence thinking, we've got a deal for May, but it's not a good deal, but I'm not sure I can really go for a no deal because it may be too traumatic, will somehow get some comfort and we'll go down that route.
All right, OK, Steve, very clear prediction. Thank you, and a positive one too. The DUP will vote against her in an initial vote of confidence in Parliament. They will again vote then with the government on the second vote 14 days later if they like her replacement. And this is now the method under the Fixed Term Parliament Act, that you lose a motion of confidence, but then there's a couple of weeks for the government to sort things out and indeed possibly change the leader. That would follow, of course, her losing a vote and losing the confidence of the House. We're going to finish up tonight in County Tyrone talking to Brendan, who's a new caller. Hi, Brendan.
Hello, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. So, Northern Ireland, I don't think Northern Ireland's ever been talked about more, really, has it?
No, it hasn't been, unfortunately. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, but I just want to give a few home truths. The DUP are getting centre stage here. I just want to say a few things. Firstly, they only represent about 27% of the electorate in Northern Ireland. And secondly, if you let me say it, they're the toxic party of Northern Ireland. They're the toxic party of the UK. As you know, they're anti-abortion, they're anti-LGBT. But a few things you mightn't realise. They're anti, to use their words, Church of Rome. They're anti-Irish, they're anti-Catholic, they're an absolute toxic party. The only reason they wanted the people in Northern Ireland it's only the extreme unionists in Northern Ireland that listen to them.
But Brendan, whether you're right or not in what you've just said, they've got 10 MPs.
They've got 10 MPs. The other extremists on the other side have got 7 that don't go to Parliament for well-known reasons. But the only reason they wanted Brexit, they want a hard border. They want a Trump-type wall built along the Irish border. They say they don't, but they absolutely do. And the business people in Northern Ireland are against them.
Brendan,
farmers in Northern Ireland are against them.
I'm out of time, Brendan. Can I just ask you, do you think the DUP are finished with Mrs May?
I think they are. They have to be. The DUP basically aren't getting their way. I think all that whole deal. I blame the Queen for allowing May to set up the Parliament with them in the first place. That should never happen because they've set Northern Ireland peace process back 20 years.
They're very important, Brendan. Folks, I think she'll lose by 100 or so. She'll go back to Brussels. There'll be a minor concession. She'll still lose. There'll be a crisis, and Parliament will agree to delay the date we leave the European Union by another year. I hope I'm really, really badly wrong, but I feel a second referendum is getting closer. I'm back tomorrow at 6. At 10 tonight, it's Tom Swarbrick. But up next, it's Ian Dale.
Nigel, thank you very much. We have a cracker of a show lined up for you tonight. On Cross Question, we have a stellar panel. Sir Nicholas Soames, the Conservative MP for Mid Sussex, Martin Howe QC,